You should imagine, listening to me, that you have had already a long and enthusiastic presentation on the social construction of policy instruments. When I gather that you know about that. And so my actual entrance point is saying, okay, if this is happening, can we perhaps learn from innovation studies and from STS about how these things, not how it goes, but how you can have an interesting look at how it goes, because it's different between the various areas of innovation and innovation in governance. So my starting point is perhaps obvious, but it needs to be repeated, that working technologies, so not in a museum, are socio-material necessarily, and that you can bring that out also by saying a technology is always a configuration that works. And if you use the word configuration, you can still have various degrees of social and material included in it. Innovation journeys, this notion of journey, I'll explain a bit more detail. And then the key point in my earlier work, but also now today, is that there is only a limited number of patterns in these innovation journeys. And you can actually think of it as institutionalization or outcome of co-evolution, and I'll mention that briefly later on. The sort of insights that there are, particularly in innovation studies, are somewhat biased towards the typical pattern of industrial product and process innovations, which is a pattern which actually emerged in the course of the 19th century. And so you can actually locate it as an historically evolved pattern. And that might actually lead to a question which wasn't originally in my presentation. But I want to sort of mention that already, that you could also look at a pattern of, say, journeys of governance and legal and social innovation, and then ask the sort of meta-level question, how did that emerge, if it is emerging? So it would be a sociological question about the emergence of certain patterns. And then the question about other patterns, and we'll come to that towards the end. So the socio-material technology, in this case of crash barriers, processing people, and the technology is more widely used, this type of technology. You can also process cows that way. And the obvious thing, I suppose, for all of you is that the socio-material technology is a combination of the disciplining through, say, these barriers themselves, but also the disciplining of people to actually not crash the barrier, jump the barriers, or try to demolish them. And so there is obviously a social technology at work as well. This is another example of this combination of socio-material. It seemed appropriate to remind you of Latour's analysis of the hotel key in Berlin. The hotel keys in other cities are similar in their dynamics, but he wrote the story inspired by his stay in a Berlin hotel. And the whole thing here is that you see the manager with his program wants to get back the key, but then people forget, the guests take it with them. And then there is a little note on the desk, and then there is a little sign on the key, and sometimes the address is on the key. So if you've taken it, you can send it back. And then there is more heavier keys, more weight attached to them, so it becomes uncomfortable to take the key with you, and so on and so forth. And there are all sorts of further stories. The wish of the hotel manager has gained reality through the key. The point I want to make here is that actually whatever the shape of the key is the outcome, and is a sense, is the contested boundary between the program and the anti-program. And as a sort of technical fix, it can stabilize that boundary until you get key cards and electronic locks. And then the whole thing starts to shift again in other directions. So, how do these innovations emerge that I showed you? There is this metaphor of a journey. It's a very powerful metaphor, but it could be interpreted as a journey towards a destination. And the whole thing about innovation is that it's open-ended. And definitely, that's the point that Van der Ven and his co-authors emphasize, all sorts of vicissitudes during the journey. You go in another direction than you thought, things don't work out, you have to shift, try again. And so the picture on the cover of his book is that of a journey in the open seas, where you don't have a compass, you have a certain sense of direction perhaps, but you don't know how the wind and the waves actually will throw you off course. The case studies that Van der Ven et al. Did, but also other case studies, tend to focus on early stages because they're about what's happening in the firm or in the organization or cluster of organizations that's working on the innovation, the prototypes, the first market introductions. But the journey continues. There is more innovation also during diffusion, uptake, and so on. And the other thing that we should add is the whole idea of multi-level dynamics, that it's not just a particular hotel key or a particular crash barrier. It's embedded in wider dynamics, which you can actually usefully analyze as multi-level dynamics. This is about longer, if you look at the longer-term evolution of the telephone, there you see that it starts in a very different manner originally in the 1880s so than it became later, and you see that it actually starts to branch out in different kinds of telephones and telephone systems, all sorts of additional services. This is just to show you that at one moment I did my homework. It's not to explain everything. It's just a visual rhetoric, you could say. There is branching, there are shifts, and so on. The multi-level pattern is, you could say, you have the niches where novel configurations are developed, and this is sort of highlighted by enlarging it, and there are all sorts of things happening there. And these keywords are coming from studies that people have done in quite some detail. There is the regimes, like, say, technological paradigms, but it's actually a patchwork of regimes. And there is this notion of landscapes, socio-technical landscapes. These three levels, you could say, or layers, are ways of actually looking at innovations in terms of different dynamics. And they have different time horizons often. And also in the way that it's being used by a number of people, including myself, there is this notion that things that happen in a niche might actually grow, diffuse, and perhaps lead to regime changes, and in the end to transition. So the people from transition studies have been taking this up en masse, you could say. The socio-technical landscape is important also for the later discussion of innovation in governance. The whole notion of landscape is much broader than the notion of framing conditions that is normally used in innovation studies, like, say, the patent system. That's one of the framing conditions for innovation in the various areas. The way I look at it, and that I think is fruitful, that you think of it, that it's important that there are gradients in the landscape, like hills and valleys. And so if you have a journey, you have choices whether to go up or down, whether to take the easy road or take the more difficult road. It's still a metaphor, but I think it's a useful metaphor. And you can continue and develop this a bit further. I'm not going into the details, but it's clear that a landscape, understood in this way, shapes actions and perceptions, not in a deterministic way. It's an affordance. And there are all sorts of ordering which shape the landscape. I will have some examples. And it is itself constructed, but it's part of the institutionalization processes. It has a longer-term dynamics than some of the immediate innovations that are developed, say, in these niches. This is a well-known example from science technology studies of a bit of the socio-technical landscape on Long Island near New York, where some of the bridges are so low that buses, the double-deckers, cannot pass under them, or just the single buses. And it was actually designed for that purpose by Robert Moses, the city architect in the 1920s.